65 years old 2400 rated Grandmaster crushed Kramnik. Pawn to c4, knight to f6, the English opening, pawn to g3, pawn to c6, knight to f3, pawn to d5, pawn to b3, bishop to g4, bishop to g2, pawn to e6, white castles kingside, knight b8 to d7, bishop to b2, bishop to d6, pawn to d3, black castles kingside, knight b1 to d2, now we have a reverse Torre-like structure. Rook to e8, pawn to h3, bishop to h5, rook to e1, pawn to a5, pawn to a3, pawn to e5, c takes d5, c takes d5, knight to h4, knight to c5, Kramnik has already equalized, queen to c2, knight to e6, rook a1 to c1, knight to d4, queen to d1, knight to b5, knight to b1, queen to d7, king to h2, this appears to be a mistake, black has a slight advantage now, rook to a6, knight to f3, pawn to e4, d takes e4, knight to e4, rook to f1, bishop to b8, knight to c3, knight b5 takes c3, bishop takes c3, rook a6 to e6. Bishop to e1, pawn to h6, rook to c2, of course not bishop takes a5 because of knight takes f2, rook takes f2, bishop takes g3 check and white is losing, bishop to a7, queen to c1, bishop to b6, Kramnik has a clear advantage now, pawn to e3, queen to b5, knight to d4, bishop takes d4, e takes d4, bishop to f3, a terrible blunder by Kramnik. After bishop takes f3 he simply thought that the rook is hanging but totally missed bishop e2 after queen takes rook. When black loses all his advantage and the game would likely end in a draw, bishop takes f3, knight takes g3, Kramnik loses his mind now, f takes g3, rook to g1 was much better. Queen takes f1, bishop to f2, queen to d3, rook to c3, queen to f5, king to g2, rook to f6, queen to c2, the position is hopeless for black now. Queen to d7, pawn to g4, rook to c6, rook to c5, rook to d8, queen to f5, rook takes c5, queen takes d7, rook takes d7, d takes c5, pawn to d4, king to f1, pawn to d3, king to e1, pawn to d2 check, king to d1, white is totally winning and Tarjan converts smoothly, king to f8, bishop to g3, king to e7, bishop to d6 check, king to e6, king takes d2, pawn to b6, king to e3, b takes c5, bishop takes c5, rook to d8, pawn to b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, pawn to f5, pawn to b5, f takes g4, h takes g4, pawn to g6, pawn to b6, pawn to h5, pawn to g5, king to d7, pawn to b7, Kramnik resigned here, a really painful defeat for Kramnik. Thank you. Please like, share and subscribe. Also comment your feedback. Have a great day.